Hello everybody. Unfortunately for me, the botanical gardens are closed. I am here outside them at one of the trees that contains a beehive. And there's some very unusual activity taking place at this hive. I'm following a piece of it at the moment. Obviously, as most of you know who know me, I pay very close attention to living things, living beings, and living places, and transformations that occur in them over time, but also in their behaviors and their relationships. And this place that I'm at the moment is one of the primary places that I'm used to doing that. Although the rest of Golden Gate Park is open, there are many bicyclists and joggers, and I suspect that those people who are exercising are producing much higher aerosol loads, and I doubt that 6 feet is a safe distance from them. I doubt it very much, in fact. However, most likely, given the numbers that we've seen, and that's most of what we have to go on, our chances of encountering an actually infected person are still very small. These are the sage flowers that are currently blooming, along with many other flowers. My friend Ryan was earlier making a video in which he uncovered the eggs at a nest of Canadian geese, or Opspini, as I think they're called in Blackfoot. Here are some other flowers that are blooming. And he was associating this full moon with the real origins of Easter, which are not conserved in Western culture. We get kind of a fantasy version, but essentially he was demonstrating that right now, at this moon time, if you go out and if the relationships with the animals and the moon cycle are appropriately aligned, you will find eggs hidden in nests. So back to the beehive. In any case, to circle back on some threads I previously touched on, I don't feel safe walking near people who are running or jogging, even though right now, at this point, given the numbers, I think our actual chances, if we take for example known cases, right, the numbers that we have, and we should very much realize that statistics, the data we get from statistics is almost always very incomplete. We get a little snapshot, and the characteristics of that snapshot are fundamentally dependent on all kinds of variables: how the data is collected, where it's collected, who's collecting it, why they're collecting it, how good are their collection methods, what's the scope of the snapshot, all kinds of things, right? So it's not reasonable to presume that the data that we have at the moment is in any way accurate. It's also difficult to say precisely how it might be inaccurate, but we might imagine that if, for example, we are told that there are 373,000 cases confirmed in the United States, then that might correspond, let's just say that that's off by 10, by a factor of 10. So there's actually 3.7 million present infections in the population, many of which will apparently be asymptomatic. So if that's true, something like your chance of encountering someone, an actual person who is infected directly while you're outside, if those numbers are true, are about 1 in 100. Not exactly that, but they're close, right? They're like 1.3 something, maybe in 100. So not particularly high. However, statistics are misleading. The fact that the statistics propose a probability of 1 in 100 doesn't mean you can't have 15 encounters when out for a walk, right? 1 in 100 is a statistical mean that is useful primarily only in evaluating group situations, and you can't evaluate individual probabilities that way. In other words, probabilities at the level of the individual are extremely murky mathematically. But that's not what I'm here really to talk about. I'm just kind of explaining why I'm going to be walking around the same area for a while I'm talking. Because I don't feel comfortable around people who are jogging or bicycling, though perhaps a little more so around the people who are bicycling. I think those people are producing vastly more, like little clouds of aerosol from their lungs, right? Everyone has seen what it looks like when, you exhale in the cold. Yeah, you see steam. But even in warm air, you're exhaling aerosols. Everyone does. So I think the authorities have not been responsible in talking to us about this, even though I was aware of this 4 weeks ago. Only recently have there been a couple of studies done that show that viruses such as those that communicate influenza or perhaps COVID, otherwise known as SARS-2, can ride in the regular aerosols of exhalations. And if that's true, which it almost certainly is, it's not a matter of whether it's true or not, it's essentially a fact. What's a little more concerning is the question of whether or not people who are exercising are producing vastly more aerosols, and I will say they certainly are, and they are expelling those aerosols at a much higher pressure, right? If I blow out fiercely, that's a very different acceleration from what happens if I simply exhale. Yeah. That's interesting. So someone just came out of the gardens, somebody who ordinarily works there, and I wonder what he was doing in there. I guess some of the employees can perhaps go in the gardens at will. So, yeah, I don't feel comfortable right now around people who are exercising. And although the park is open, it's filled with joggers and runners and bicyclists and such. And that just doesn't feel safe to me. I might feel a little bit safer with a mask, but that wouldn't make me feel super safe either, for lots of different reasons. Masks confer a modicum of protection for things we might inhale, and their protectivity changes over the time we are wearing them, so that as they become saturated with moisture, they're more transmissive and less effective. In any case, so there's a little bit of introduction, and I have to find new places to walk, which I'm going to work on, and I might even work on it right during this video because I have an idea. The problem with it is that if I pursue that idea, I'm going to be exposed to traffic, and I don't really want my listeners to hear all of that. But right now, I'm at one of the trees outside the garden. This is, I believe, an old cypress, and this is one of the local trees that has a beehive in it most of the time. And this hive is active today. I don't know if you can see it, but it's up in there's a hole where a branch was long ago cut away. And that hole actually goes through the tree and is vast, and there's almost always an active hive there, although for many months, for more than a year, prior to recent transformations in human culture, that hive appeared to be inactive, which I found very surprising and unlikely, because I've never seen it inactive before. And I've learned many things from watching the bees at that hive, but one of the things I saw today was something I've never seen. I saw occupants of that hive eject an invading bee from another hive. That's a strange risk for that bee to take. I don't know whether that bee was a scout. I can't tell for sure. I do know that that bee did not belong to that hive, and one of the hive protector bees, which are tasked with both identifying and ejecting invaders, locked itself in combat with that bee, and they fell together to the ground, where they tussled for a bit before the invader left the area and the defender returned to the hive. Now, I've learned a great deal of things from watching insects, but particularly I've been fascinated by both ambush predators like jumping spiders and praying mantises, and the branch of insects referred to in Western scientific literature as Hymenoptera. You'll notice the presence of the phoneme set hymen. The Hymenoptera are matriarchal societies, in the sense that, for example, in honeybees, when you see honeybees on flowers, you're seeing females. The males are relatively helpless. They are stingerless. Their eyes are much larger. And they exist really for one purpose, which is to inseminate the queen on flight day. On flight day, a new queen, unfertilized, will leave a hive and be followed by a group of males, some of which will successfully inseminate her. She will carry those eggs for the rest of her life, not dissimilar to what happens in ants, by the way, except that after this, in ants, the queen loses her wings and founds a colony. In bees, more complex behavior ensues, but not entirely dissimilar. The new queen will found a new colony eventually, and the males remaining in the hive after that flight are generally ejected, and it's a rather tragic thing to see, because all of their lives they've been taken care of by the females, who are infertile except for the queen. And then one day suddenly, for reasons they don't, well, it's not clear that bees and reasons are things that go together, but for no apparent, you know, there's no apparent justification for the sudden decision of the hive to stop taking care of all of the males and kick them out of the hive to the waiting swarms of, well, there may not be swarms, but to predators waiting outside the hive. And Yellowjackets are really good at sort of paying attention to when this occurs and taking advantage of, they eat the male bees, right? Because the male bees have no mandibles, they can't defend themselves, they have no sting, they're essentially completely helpless. So the Hymenoptera, which includes bumblebees, bees of various kinds, ants, wasps, hornets, all of these kinds of creatures, they have various organized societies, and somewhat like humans, they build collective housing, right? Although the housing is primarily for purposes of reproduction. If we are thinking about function, which is often a mistake that humans make. Humans think, what does a thing do? And they look for a function. By the way, if you actually figured out what our societies do, the functions you would identify would be insane and unsurvivable. But it can be very misleading to look at living things from the perspective of function. I'm not suggesting we stop doing that, but rather that we become aware that there are a variety of other really important and useful perspectives that we can adopt, that might even help us understand that our kind of one-legged dependence on viewing things from the perspective of function is blinding. The bees produce vastly more honey than they can ever use. And humans would be inclined to ask, why? And what they're looking for there is a reason. But reason is a peculiar thing that is not without analogs in some living relationships and organisms. But reason is a verbal conceptual thing. And it has not been my experience, perhaps I will one day be otherwise enlightened, that living things use language in concepts in the formal ways that humans do. There's something else going on there. And if we insist on our own viewpoint, which we consider privileged, this viewpoint of purposes and reasons, we're going to miss most of what's going on. And much like in a dream where you're able to remember the plot of a dream, but you can be absolutely certain that the dream was not the plot. And the plot is at very best the skeletal remains of the vivid, complex, multi-dimensional, multi-emotional, very differently purposed experiences that we have when dreaming. So in the same way that a plot is insufficient to capture a dream, functions and purposes are insufficient to capture, not that we need to capture it, they're insufficient to deeply observe, understand, and participate in living relationships. And yet, our cultures are founded on precisely these things. Now, as I mentioned, the bees produce vastly more honey than their hive can ever use. And I'm not going to say there is a reason for that, but one of the consequences of that behavior is that many other creatures are often fed on honey. Beehives are relatively used to having external creatures, honey badgers, bears, possibly mice, raccoons. There are bee hunting wasps in Japan. The Yellowjackets here have a invasive relationship to honeybees. Lots of other creatures get honey because bees make honey. Well, the because word is a little bit suspect there, but we all understand how English works. So I won't go meta-semantic at the moment. It's not that bees make honey with the idea that other creatures will be able to eat it. But their hives, they have learned over evolutionary time to not only survive, but maybe even to thrive from the occasional intrusion of another creature into the hive, some destruction, some disorganization, some death. And the resulting hives are stronger. Humans have models of this in Darwinism and competition. Those models are wildly incomplete, and I would argue very, very immature. We've had these ideas as a people for, 2 or 3 generations at most. I've seen amazing things at the mouths of beehives. And in case it isn't obvious yet, it's my intention to compare us with them because they make something not entirely they make something that has at least modest resemblances to what we call a city. In that they get together en masse, they're organized in hierarchies, and they collect and conserve commodities together. Those are some superficial resemblances. There are many others. And one of the best books on this topic I ever encountered was a book by one of the men who taught me very deeply about Hymenoptera. In his book, The Super Organism, that he writes with Bert Holdobler, I think, who is one of his partners in hymenopteric research. He's an entomologist. His name is escaping me at the moment, but he's super famous, and it'll probably come back to me, so I'll just continue going. But yeah, his book, The Super Organism, is a wonderful survey of the analogs between Hymenoptera and humans. One of the most astonishing things that I've seen at the mouth of a beehive is a bee attempting to eject a yellowjacket. This would be not dissimilar to seeing a Buddhist monk repulse an attack from an armed horseman who was armored and had highly advanced weapons. So the Yellowjackets, compared to the bees, the mandibles of the Yellowjackets are incredibly powerful. They can snip off legs and wings. The bees' mandibles are relatively, maybe, wild guess here, a fifth as powerful. The bee has one sting, which if it uses, it dies. And if it dies while repulsing a Yellowjacket, it fails. It fails to repulse that Yellowjacket. So it can't use its stinger, even though it has one. The Yellowjacket can sting indefinitely, at least as far as I know. And its exoskeleton, its chitinous exoskeleton, is much stronger than that of the bee. So again, it's similar to combat between an armored opponent and a naked guy. But the bees are adept at repulsing yellowjackets, and in some places they've even become adept at repulsing the terrifyingly effective bee hunting hornets that are like the size of my index finger. Watching a bee wrestle a yellowjacket is an astonishing thing. The yellowjacket looks lazy and confused primarily because it is. It never really had to do the kind of work that a bee does. Because the yellowjackets are strong, they're voracious, they're extremely vital, they're relatively lazy compared to the bee, as you might imagine men who always wore armor would be compared to someone who, and used, I don't know, spears, compared to someone who, for example, was a martial artist. The martial artist would have kinds of endurance that the armored man would not. Though in this case, both of the creatures in combat are females. Here's that same tree from a distance. It's beautiful. It's incredible. I've watched a single bee repulse 8 to 12 serious yellowjacket incursions without being injured and without using its stinger. The yellowjacket's going all out trying to kill the bee. The bee is wrestling the yellowjacket in a way that is so sophisticated that the difference in intelligence is staggering. The bee must avoid the yellowjacket's sting, and it must avoid its mandibles without fail. If it fails one time in either of those tasks, it will lose and probably be killed. Once the yellowjacket gets any kind of a hold on the defending bee, the game is over. I have never one time seen that happen. Never. Every encounter I've ever seen between a yellowjacket and a defending bee resulted in the yellowjacket being repulsed. The yellowjacket has about, well, I'd say 1.3 to 2 times the mass of a bee. And it's not entirely clear to me what the yellowjacket would do if it got inside the hive. Like, what is it after? Why is it taking that risk? Because the hive is a complex structure within. The assets in the hive are essentially twofold: larvae and honey. Larvae are a treasured food among many creatures, including various birds, and just about everything on Earth that eats anything likes honey, for obvious reasons. But there's so many other features of the hives that are astonishing. There's so much I want to share about this, and yet I have another agenda today. But I will mention a couple of things. The bees ranging over a terrain, right? They form a network between not just flowering plants, but plants that produce nectar at the joints where a leaf emerges. The bees, like the hummingbirds, are aware of all kinds of sources of pollen and various sources of nectar. Not all of those types of nectar come directly from flowers. They also gather waters. The water that collects on a clover leaf is different from the water that collects on a plantain leaf, which is different from the water that collects on a blade of grass. These waters contain complex chemistries. The bees can use the environment like a living, intelligent pharmacopoeia, which they do. And what we call honey is actually the result of the bees' incredibly complex reproductive relationships with hundreds or thousands of vegetative organisms in the environment. So that a beehive is like a living library, and it is it's an integrative, associated summation lens, right? There's something in the beehive that is like the sum of all of the organisms with which it has reproductive relations, and whose reproductive activity the bees facilitate, right? In human terms of function, right, and purpose. The bees, I think, don't see it this way at all, and in fact comprise what I understand to be an anciently conserved, impossibly sophisticated intelligence that, were we to have direct access to conscious relation with that intelligence, I think that our wildest fictions and fantasies would be obliterated by the facts of the actually accessible intelligence in a hive of bees or wasps or ants. But most people will think me mad for saying that. And they'll say, well, there's no evidence of that. I haven't seen that in the literature. Edward O. Wilson is the author of both a book called The Social Insects, which is fabulous, recommend it. Him and Holdobler wrote that, and they wrote a gigantic tome called The Ants, absolutely astonishing, and another huge tome called The Super Organism. Or maybe just Super Organism, I can't recall the exact title. But those are men that I've learned a lot from and helped me to see things about the ants and bees that I had not yet been able to observe in my own relationships with them. The Yellowjacket nests are also very interesting and dangerous. Many people aren't capable really of discriminating between bees and yellowjackets, so when they encounter a yellowjacket nest and often get badly stung, they think they were attacked by bees. That's not what happened. It's almost impossible to get a beehive to attack you. It's really easy to get a nest of hornets or yellowjackets angry enough to come after you in a swarm. And when you see cartoons and things of swarms of something chasing somebody, it's not bees. Bees don't really... I've never seen that behavior from bees under any circumstances. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's really unlikely and very uncommon in my perspective. I imagine if you went straight at a hive, you might be able to encourage some goodly number of the bees to attack you, but I think they would be unlikely to chase you down the street the way that wasps and hornets and stuff do. The wasps mark you with a chemical, and that chemical spreads aggression among their cohort and marks you well enough that they can find you, if they want, probably a mile away, right? So you can run all you like. They're going to catch up to you in general. Although they eventually break off the attack, thankfully, in most cases. Now, of course, we became very concerned in the 1980s because Africanized honeybees from an experimental colony in South America, or from a research station in South America, got out into the wild. These bees are extremely aggressive. They, like wasps, will mark you, and once they do, they'll just sting you to death if they can. Thankfully, that threat, though it's real, there are, these kinds of bees in the world. That threat never really materialized in terms of being a common thing that we encounter here in the United States. Though there are states in which that species of bee has gained a foothold. Now, those bees come from Africa, where the predators that might, be inclined to go after hives are larger and fiercer and more numerous. So it's not terribly surprising that those bees would have developed a more severe defensive strategy. One of the differences between beehives and wasp hives and Hymenopteran colonies and humans' activities, there's lots and lots of differences. But what we're doing is abstract, and what they're doing is embodied. So, although we collect embodied commodities such as food or knowledge, We also are very highly motivated by abstract commodities such as money or power. And unlike the bees, which support the life essence of nearly everything on Earth by just doing what they do, our people seem to support something that's kind of like the opposite of life essence, which is technology. We build objects and machines, and we'll go to any lengths to preserve those objects and machines. And not just to preserve them, but to preserve certain forms of them that are particularly lethal, contagious, prodigious in their reproductive capacities. For example, we don't think of cars as having reproductive capacities, but we reproduce cars. We are the reproductive organs for those things that you see, those things that resemble both armored animals and maybe even demons or something. I mean, if you look at the front of a car at night, that's a scary face of a non-living thing that just to continue to exist has to keep killing stuff on Earth. So the humans are really confused as animals and have embarked on a long history of misrelation, not only with the origins of their own bodies and minds, but with the intelligences in nature upon which our own intelligence floats. Yeah. And that's very confusing if you don't understand the history of it. And while I've made a lot of videos and sort of audio casts about these topics, which you're welcome to peruse at your leisure should you have any interest. But my goal today is a little bit simpler than to illustrate that. What I want to be clear about right now is just that for the first time in my life, my species is directly experiencing a crisis that they can't deny. They tried, right? They tried to pretend, oh, this thing that's going on, it's just going to be like the flu. We'll get over it. A few people will die, don't worry. But that didn't work. So now we're in a situation where denial has been largely refuted, right? We're saying, well, you can't just deny it. And I mean, we're in a really bizarre period of history where there's no real consequence for just lying your head off, right? You can make predictions or statements in public as a politician, as the president, and just completely lie. And some cohort of the population will start cheering. Other cohorts will claim you're lying. But there's no real system whereby consequences for lying or making really deadly or stupid predictions return to their origin and are visited upon the person acting thus. Now we do have this stuff called law still, but what happened over the past, say, 20 or 30 years is that the nature of media, of the press, changed dramatically in our country and became both disoriented and reoriented. And it became oriented primarily just to capture attention for the sake of selling products and commodities and for the sake of, quote, earning illusory commodity called money, so that they went after fear, outrage, cuteness, sex appeal, and trigger emotions. Now one could argue that this is a natural evolution of the press that we're familiar with from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and so forth. And that wouldn't be entirely untrue. But what we've got now are highly evolved very sophisticated mechanisms for producing toxic media. And most of us participate in that process as consumers. We listen to the news, we communicate to each other about the topics in the news very ineffectively, primarily because the substrates of our culture are built much like those that would underlie a nation of slaves. In an attempt to keep the common populace ignorant and unprotected from these kinds of assaults, certain factions in our political parties, hopefully they're fairly obvious, but I'll just name them outright, the Republicans, attacked arts, education, the infrastructure of the country over the past 30 years very successfully. And they removed relatively modest funding from those things and dumped huge quantities of that into war, prisons, and other not so intelligently humanitarian agendas, including just lining the fuck out of their own pockets. So we're now in a situation where the government as such in the United States and in many other countries, and in some it's far worse, I'll admit that, is a cartoon. Not only is it unequipped to protect you in a time of crisis, the infrastructure upon which, the very delicate infrastructure, particularly the supply line infrastructure upon which cities depend, is completely unprotected. And what that means is that if there's even and it's been this way for 30 years, we're in the first moment of seeing what that means in modern times. The slightest disruption to those supply chains and cities turn into chaotic graveyards. And that can happen overnight. And right now, everybody's nervous and they're concerned. They've never been to the supermarket and seen aisles with nothing in it, or, empty shelves. They've never seen everybody walking around wearing gloves and masks. Most of us are frightened and disoriented, just as the kinds of just as you might expect consumer slave-like peoples would be. And among us, there are castes, right? Or castes, depending on how it's actually pronounced. Some of us are aware that in India, a very ancient civilization compared to ours, which is barely, a little over 200 years old. In India, you have a situation thousands of years old. And they have distinct hierarchies that you're born into. Those hierarchies are established primarily by birth. And they're mostly unshakable. What we have here is a fuzzier version of that based on material wealth, right? So rather than having actual castes or castes, slaves and untouchables and farmers and merchants and bankers, and we have something that's very similar but not as what's the right word? It's not as explicit. It's much more cloudy, and it's based on things like who you know, social relationships, money, family history, land ownership, material wealth, educational expertise, things like this. Political affiliations, political history, political expertise. So we have castes or castes here too. Ours are just more vague. And when crisis emerges, it will immediately become you'll see, we've already seen, right? We've seen the people, for example, like the Seething Idiot we refer to as our president, say things that essentially mean, who cares if the poor people die or the old people die or some other people die, as long as we keep making objects and distributing them, everything will be fine. Most of us who aren't in one of the classes that would otherwise acquire the protections of such a situation should be profoundly aware that to make a statement like that is to point a gun not only at our own heads, but at the heads of the entire history of our families, which we are the living moment of, and directly and intentionally at the history and future of life on Earth. Because those people are stupid enough that when they see that there's a crisis coming, they're going to see that merely as an opportunity to make more money. So rather than trying to avert a crisis, they may have a vested interest in either continuing the crisis as long as possible or in doubling down on it. In other words, exacerbating the crisis. And as far as graveyards filling up, they have no need to care about that. As long as it's not them and their own family, hey, you know, if there's piles of dead in the street, we're just going to drive our $50,000 cars right past that stuff. The civil defense budget in the United States is there primarily to protect the executive branch. It has almost nothing to do anymore with protecting the common people, though it once did. And as the situation we're in progresses, if we're not extremely careful, thankfully we have states, and states have some ability to self-determine their priorities, right? But if we didn't have that, what we would see, and what we may yet see, are a staggering cascade of immediate transformation of things that, fictions that we refer to as rights. Those will disappear, right? Since they were fictions to begin with, and they only existed for those people who could afford to defend them either with money or power or relational associations in the systems, rights never really existed except on paper for the common person. Or the degree to which they existed was so minimal as to be essentially vapor rights, right? That's what we've had so far, vapor rights. And we're not likely, what's going to happen now is that the vapor will dissipate, right? The heat of the crisis will blow off the vapor, and ordinary humans will realize, hey, not only do we not have rights now, we never actually did. It was like this fictional thing, and it kept us believing in a system that's founded on fictions and working for the sake of that system, and so on and so forth. So right now we're really in a place where it's very dangerous. And we don't have another system to switch to because we never established one together. And most of us, much like the male bees in a beehive, the system has taken relative care of us. And so, you know, we have opinions and ideas and fears and all of this. But should the governing bodies decide that we don't matter, we're going to have very little recourse, yeah? We're not like the bees who eject the Yellowjackets, and we're not like the Yellowjackets. We're like the male bees, essentially. We're vulnerable. We're like fundamentally, profoundly vulnerable. All you have to do is keep us from getting food for a while and, you know, you're done. So we're in a really astonishing time, and it's a time that I've long seen coming. I mean, I've been aware that there was no infrastructure protecting us, that cities are absolutely unsustainable by nature, that everything the humans are doing as groups and as a species and as societies is effectively blatantly insane and catastrophically hubristic, right? It's this ridiculous, inflated sense of pride and entitlement that has got us into the position of the deadliest thing that's ever happened on Earth, with the possible exception of when bacteria started producing oxygen a long time ago and killed off everything, all the cyanobacteria that existed before then, or most of them, or drove them into new evolutionary niches, whatever happened. I mean, the extinctions events were really significant, too, but we've comprised one, yeah? And we'll be lucky if we're not included in the one we've comprised. The the crises that we're facing right now are the leading edge of an array of things that are certain to occur, right? So it's not like if someone says, well, when this blows over, whatever they're referring to as this isn't a single thing. I think when they do that, they're saying something like, well, when humans get control of the coronavirus. But this pandemic is just the first in a sequence of pandemics that are certain to occur, and there are going to be other cofactors that will definitely transform the face of our humanity and our societies and our priorities dramatically. We were able to, not meaning you and I, we haven't actually established a we. The we that you hear in the media and in news is another fiction, right? It's a collective fiction of those who are subject to something, as well as those who are complicit in producing something. That's the we that we hear in the news. When we Americans, it's we who are subject to the activities of the nation and the corporations, and also we who are complicit in producing those activities. But you and I, the people themselves, did not assemble this collective. We subscribed to it by default, right? Because there wasn't something else to do. We never actively assembled together any kind of really meaningful collectivity, with the possible exception of what we refer to as families, though there are some other weird exceptions like gangs and subcultures. So the humans have the capacity to assemble societies. And instead of doing that for a long time, what we've done is we've subscribed to societies whose priorities and activities are catastrophically antiquated, have nothing to do with what's actually going on right now, and are inclined to both deny and profit from any catastrophic consequence of their insane misbehavior. So that's the situation at the moment. And it's very dangerous for the common person. Most of us live in cities, and if the very delicate supply lines that allow cities to persist are interrupted, those cities will collapse immediately. And if the medical infrastructure is overwhelmed, and believe me, that's a very near target, everything will go to shit, because now things that used to be survivable, like a burn or an infection or a broken bone, will become lethal, as they were for most of human history. Inoculations will stop, the old diseases will come back, the things that humans thought they had mastered in nature will come back with a vengeance and teach us the error of our hubris. So all of that probably sounds pretty grim, and in many ways it is. And we hear people saying, like, well, people will wake up, they'll do different things. They might, but it's not incredibly likely. There have been all kinds of terrible catastrophes in history that didn't wake the people up. World War II didn't stop us from making wars or anything like it, especially not the United States. Even though, the world sort of took a pause at the end of World War II and went like, okay, we need to be doing this differently. That's not what happened. Instead, what happened is we doubled down on the kinds of insanity that we were enacting before World War I and II, and we created situations so unimaginably misdirected and abominable that were we to have them paraded before us, all of us, without exception, would droop our heads in shame and cry. But we don't have to live that way, and we don't have to live this way. We are fundamentally social animals. The fact that societies exist is evidence of a propensity in us, a hunger, a thirst to belong to a collective that is meaningfully composed, intelligently directed, and in which we can have roles that are heroic and beautiful and creative and human and alive and enriching, and there's nothing stopping us from doing that. It's unlikely that the large-scale collectives are going to move in that direction right now, but the capacity for this lies primarily with small, highly motivated, intelligent groups. We're not going to get America to suddenly change direction. Not that that won't happen, it might. And other nations will change direction. I'm not sure if this is true, but I saw news that Spain, for example, had announced that it was going to begin distributing universal basic income, which would be an astonishing and interesting development. But what I want to communicate to you today is that small, tightly knit groups we can assemble those instantaneously right now. There's nothing standing in our way from that. 4 or 5 people, intelligently and creatively motivated, skillful, can produce what humans have been doing since the beginning of time, what primates do, what dolphin pods do, what orcas do, what beehives do, what wasp colonies do. And what I want you to understand is human media has been instructing us about this for at least the past 50 years. Half the movies you see, at least, are about a small, tightly knit group of intelligent humans who overcome some kind of impossible menace, right? And so we make these films that demonstrate something absolutely primordial about being human, and people all over the world are wildly excited by this, but instead of doing it, we've been consuming the cartoon of it, yeah? A team of 5, an impossible mission, right? It's like, this has been going on for 40, 50 years in cinema, but very few human beings other than hacker collectives, thieves, criminals, gang members, and politicians have been doing it, right? Politicians are really good at this, by the way. They can control an entire nation with a very small, largely undefended group, as we've seen in recent times, right? Just by taking advantage of this. So we have the capacity to form small, highly effective, intelligent groups. In a pod of dolphins, you might have a dolphin that's incredibly good at sensing where food can be found. You've got another dolphin that's really good at deflecting a shark attack. Another dolphin that's really good at actually fighting a shark. A dolphin that can detect mechanical threats. A dolphin that can detect chemical threats in the water. And these form a superposition of dolphin intelligence that grants each one of them the effective abilities of what humans would refer to as a superhero. So by collectively magnifying the gifts and abilities of each individual, the group acquires a superposition over what their ordinary abilities would be, and can in effect accomplish things that would be otherwise impossible. And it's very exciting to accomplish these kinds of things, I know, because I've been inside of groups like this. In case it isn't obvious, what we call corporations, what we call the army, I mean, all of these things that we actually do are counterfeit versions of this, right? Where, you know, people have roles. Some of those roles are actually kind of heroic. For example, right now, doctors and nurses are risking their lives to keep common people who've acquired this virus alive. And there are other kinds of heroic things. There are mothers, right, who are taking care of children and animals, and there are fathers who are providing for families and relatives, and there are single people out in the world who've built allo families, which are extended families of choice that you assemble by yourself. And you select fathers and mothers for these allo families, and children are adopted from the social environment into them. And so we have all of these astonishing abilities, and right now we don't have anything better to do, most of us, or many of us anyway. So it's a perfect time to experiment with this. And it's absolutely crucial, and it's going to happen. Look, we can either go here voluntarily, or we're going to be forced, right? And it's going to be a lot better for us if we establish something that ordinary humans can switch over to, right? Where they can go like, yeah, I'm still American, but I belong to this group of people, and in that group I have this role, and that's where my identity comes from, not from my nation, from the people that I've formed an inaction body with. Yeah? And when we're separated in the way we are, most of our abilities and faculties and intelligence, we're deprived of it. And so, having been thus deprived, we hunger for it throughout our lives, and we spend thousands of hours of our life in front of screens, watching other people do other things that pretend to be valuable, and some of them are. Enough. There's been enough of that. To use colloquial language, shit just got real. And it's time, I think, for us as human beings to step up, to understand the nature of our evolutionary history as social animals, and what the capacities associated with our kind of animal really are, and to get a taste of that together, and to make that taste as contagious as we can, so that people throughout the world will stop playing the deadly fucking game of fictions that has been killing and imprisoning life on Earth for the past who knows how long, and will get us killed if we continue playing it. We can't keep pretending that the fictions that underlie the societies to which we belong are survivable, sustainable, intelligent, noble, righteous, godly, whatever the fucking equality we ascribe to them. That shit was insane. It needs to come to a stop, and the only way that's going to happen is if we can put something better together with and for each other and the history of life on Earth now. We were born for this. That of which I speak, that toward which I point, that's what we were born to do. And that's what we've been being sold fake effigies of from the moment we entered kindergarten, if not before. So let's stop buying and selling counterfeits and get a taste of the unimaginable profundity that we come to human birth carrying not only the potential for, but the absolute desire for. There isn't any other game worth the candle. And whether we step up now or after the graveyards are clogged with the bodies of our dead is a choice we'll bear responsibility for. So let's make a choice that we can be proud of, and that our children and our children's children will revere. Thank you. I'm so grateful to have a moment to explore these things with you today. I'm so grateful to have legs, to be able to breathe, that my eyes still work, that I'm alive, that I'm not trapped in my bed. Even the smallest features of common experience seem wildly luxurious to me in this time. And though I've seen it coming for a good 30 years, when it didn't come for 20, I kind of stopped expecting it, but now it's here. I don't think this will blow over. Our species might get a handle on the coronavirus, maybe, but this will not blow over. Much love to you. May you and those you love and those who love you be safe and healthy, beautiful, intelligent, and wise. Bye-bye for now.